Well, hello and welcome. I am Chris. I'm the pastor at Compass. As always, I'm so glad that you're with me today. Now, my family loves Disney, and when we get to go to Disney World, we have one rule. If Disney says you can ride it, we're going to ride it. Scary rides, boring rides, whatever. If one person in our family wants to ride it, we all do. And when our kids were really young, there was one ride that they were very anxious about, and it was the Tower of Terror. It's basically an elevator that slowly rises to the top floor before it drops. My daughter Trinity was so scared, and so Terry sat by her and talked her through the entire time they were on the ride, explaining how things worked, talking about what was happening, explaining why it wasn't really scary. And when it was time for the drop, she gave Trinity a heads up. Said, okay, it's just going to be one drop and then it's over. You can do this. The elevator rose and then it dropped. And at the bottom, Terry says, that's it, Trinity, you did it. It's all done. And then the elevator launched back into the air, throwing us up and down again multiple times. Needless to say, Trinity was not happy. This is her giving her thumbs down review after the ride. Even when it doesn't always seem to help, we still like being warned in advance when something bad is going to happen. I like it when a nurse tells me that I'm going to feel a slight pinch before they give me a shot. I prefer it when a chiropractor tells me to take a deep breath before they twist my head 180 degrees and demolish my neck bones into powder. Sometimes a heads up is nice. And in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus' disciples are asking him for a little heads up. Let's check this out in Matthew 24, 1-3. It said, Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. You see all these things, he asked? Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So Jesus tells his disciples the temple is going to be destroyed, which is really a shocking thing to say and to hear. It's the Holy of Holies, the center of Jewish life. So the disciples understandably have questions. They have three big ones. When is the temple going to be destroyed? When will Jesus be announced as the Messianic King? And when will the end of the current age come? For the disciples, all of these questions are bound up in the destruction of the temple. Will it coincide with Jesus coming out as the Messiah? Will it signal the end of the age of Jewish oppression and the start of Israel's new national Messianic age? Now, this is important because a lot of Christians see what Jesus says next as a revelation of the end times. But that's not how the disciples saw it. And like we talked about last week, I don't think that's how Jesus saw it. Rather than talking about the events that will precede the apocalyptic end of the world, Jesus seems to be talking about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem that happened 40 years later in 70 AD. He's giving his disciples a little heads up on what's coming. And I strongly encourage you to check out last week's message to get caught up. Everything here is going to be connected. But let's pick up where we left off. I'm going to read you a whole big chunk of Bible. So buckle up and hang on. Matthew 24:15 says, so when you see standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand this, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Messiah, or there he is, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I've told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, there he is out in the wilderness, do not go out. Or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. Okay, there is a lot here. But remember the questions that Jesus is answering for the disciples. When is the temple going to be destroyed? When are you going to declare that you are the Messiah? And when will this age of occupation end and a new messianic age for Israel begin? Now, Jesus is really still firmly answering the first question here. When is the temple going to fall? And I want to show you a couple things Jesus is doing here that are both interesting and informative. So let's jump ahead to the end of this whole passage and look what Jesus says there in Matthew 24:28. He says, wherever there's a carcass, there the vultures will gather. So based on where this verse is in the entire passage, it seems like Jesus is making a comment about paying attention to the signs that he has just described. That like vultures gather around a carcass, these things are also signs of the end. And that makes sense, but I don't think that's what Jesus means. Check this out. In the ancient world, people thought eagles and vultures were the same. They thought vultures were just a type of eagle. In fact, the Greek word used here for vulture is actually the Greek word for eagle. It's actually translated as eagle in other parts of the New Testament as well. Some Bible versions translate the word in this passage as eagle instead of vulture. So why is that relevant? Why does it matter that Jesus may have meant eagle instead of vulture? Well, the eagle was the symbol for Rome. Roman legions carried a standard with an eagle at the top. An eagle represented the empire. This isn't a comment about the signs of the temple's destruction. It's actually another sign supporting the fact that Jesus is talking about the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, rather than the rapture, tribulation, and apocalypse of some distant end times. Now, that's an interesting thing at the end of this long passage, but let's jump ahead and look at the beginning in Matthew 24:15. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So this verse is weird right from the get-go. I mean, Jesus quotes something that the prophet Daniel talked about, the abomination that causes desolation. What the heck is that? Well, let's start with Daniel. So around 600 years before Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD, there was another destruction of Jerusalem, a first destruction. In around 587 BC, the Babylonian armies swept into Judea and they tore down the temple and most of the city. Almost all the population was taken into exile hundreds of miles away in Babylon as slaves. Daniel was one of those people. And the book of Daniel was conceived in this period of exile. And there was something written in there that was on Jesus' mind. Let's look at it here in Daniel 9:11. His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. This is the passage in Daniel Jesus is quoting when he mentions the abomination that causes desolation. And while to us, this is weird sounding prophecy language, it's actually something Jesus' disciples would have understood immediately. It's something that alerted them to what Jesus was actually communicating. So let me tell you a story. Around 170 AD, centuries after Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians, the land of Israel was still occupied by foreign forces. It had been passed from the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the empire of Alexander the Great, and then finally to the Greek Seleucid Empire, led by a man named Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus continually faced the threat of a Jewish revolt, and he eventually just decided that it's time to crack down and get Jerusalem under control. He did this by demanding that everyone worship Zeus, specifically to worship Antiochus as Zeus in human form. The man even minted coins with his face inscribed with the words Theos Epiphanes, which meant manifest God. But there was more. It wasn't enough to just force people to worship Zeus. he also had to break and suppress their religion. So Antiochus led his army into Jerusalem, killing everyone who resisted and declaring martial law over the city. And with his boot on the necks of the people, he plundered the temple, banned all religious rites, he stopped the daily sacrifices, burned every copy of the Jewish scriptures he could find, and he required everyone to worship the Greek gods with him as the manifest God. And here's the kicker. He built an altar to Zeus in the temple, on top of the Jewish altar of burnt offerings, and then he sacrificed a pig on it, an animal that was unclean to the Jewish people. Antiochus defiled the temple by entering it, plundering it, halting the daily sacrifices, building a pagan altar in it, and sacrificing unclean animals as an act of worship to a foreign god. One might call this an abomination that brings desolation. The first century Jews did. They believed that the acts of Antiochus were the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy. Now, the book of Daniel was very popular in Jesus' day, with one reason being that it represented their deep desire to be free from the current oppression of Rome and its pagan influence. The echoes of Antiochus still resonated with the people, and the idea that Rome could do the same thing at any moment hung over their heads constantly. And in alluding to Daniel, Jesus is saying that just like Jerusalem fell 600 years ago to pagan armies, it will fall again, and it will be just as bad. And it was just as bad, if not worse. In 70 AD, Rome completely destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, and just like the Babylonians did, they just ransacked and destroyed everything. And before they tore the temple down in a sign of dominance, they hung the Roman standard on the walls, the eagle, saying that Rome is greater than your God, an act of desecration. The echoes of Daniel reverberating into the world of the first church. Now, if you're thinking that all of this is kind of confusing, you're right. This is a lot to hold in our heads, and I'm sure it was a lot for the disciples as well. People have been trying to make sense of this for hundreds of years, and they've all come to different conclusions. In spite of all the explaining I've done here, there are still a bunch of people who would disagree with everything I'm saying. So what do you do with that? How can we make sense of all this dense, complicated Bible stuff when experts still disagree on it? Understanding the context and the background of the world in which all of this was written is super important. But there's another principle we can apply to reading the Bible. Here it is. Look for what you can understand and what it says about God. Check this out, Matthew 24. Let's go back again to the first verse. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. At the heart of all of this is a warning. Remember, all of this started with the disciples asking when a horrible thing was going to happen, and with Jesus giving them warning signs so they could escape it. He's saying, when you see these things happening, get out, get to safety. And while we may have had a hard time understanding everything Jesus said, we can still see why he said it. He wanted to protect his friends from harm. He cared about them in their distress. That's something we can see and understand about God in all of this. Jesus cares about us in our distress. He loves us. Jesus could have just told them the signs of the end of the age, but he took a significant amount of time warning them to get out. He could have just given the signs, but instead he gave warning signs so they could find a way to be safe. And while safety isn't always guaranteed in this life, God's love for us is. So in all this weird, complex stuff that we're navigating through today, there is a takeaway. It's this. When the Bible is weird, God's love for us isn't. Jesus' advice to the disciples, it is in many ways the same to us today. He's saying things could get bad. And as much as you can, I want you to be safe. And when they do, you'll be tempted to fight, to take a defensive posture. You'll be tempted to organize around leaders who promise to save you and lead you back to national greatness. You'll want to puzzle over world events to try and make sense of them, to both qualify these false leaders and to make sense of end of the world timelines. But don't do any of that. Just hear me and know that I love you and want you to be okay. That's the message of Jesus. The Bible isn't always clear, but the things that need to be clear are. When Jesus talks in the strange apocalyptic language of Daniel, we can trust that God loves us. When biblical metaphors and analogies are hard to make sense of, we can trust that God loves us. When eagles and abominations and history and prophecy all smash into each other in a confusing tangle of ideas, you can trust that God loves us. He cares about you in your distress. Someday all the weird Bible stuff, it may click and it may come together in your head. And when it does, that's awesome. But even when the Bible is weird, God's love for us isn't. It's the simple thread that runs through all of the weird, and we can hold on to it when nothing else makes sense. So, may we put down our fears for the future and walk in that love. May we trust that in our distress, God sees us and loves us. That when we can't make sense of the difficult things in the Bible, that we will always find meaning in His love for us. Thank you for joining me. I hope that you will find meaning in God's love for you today, realizing how much He deeply and desperately does love you. And I hope to see you next time.